discussion, and it's a great segue into our third panel of the day, which focuses on closing Europe's digital divide. Is the connectivity toolbox the answer? And it's my pleasure to hand you over to the moderator of the session, Fiona Taylor, Head of International Public Policy, Verizon. Hi Fiona, over to you.
Hi Lynn, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this panel and for putting this event together. As always, your team has done a formidable job. Most importantly, I am not alone in this panel, and thank God. I am surrounded by exceptional experts who will help us address the question of the day. So the title of the panel is Closing Europe's Digital Divide. Is the EU toolbox the answer? I think this is a million-dollar question that we will explore in the panel. Bridging or closing the digital divide and stimulating the deployment of very high-speed connectivity networks is not a new consideration for policymakers, but it has been a growing concern over time. And needless to say, the pandemic has brought an urgency to closing the gap and to address the issues to achieve the goal. Policymakers around the world are trying to find answers and solutions to close the digital divide. We have also the infrastructure bill in the US, but in the EU, we also have the new EU Digital Decade Policy Programme 2030 that has also set new targets for 2030. And these include calling for 100% coverage of households by a gigabit network by 2030, and all populated areas should be covered by 5G. So these are very ambitious targets, and I think in the panel we will also address whether or not these are achievable with the current tools that we have available. So the title of the panel focuses specifically on the connectivity toolbox that was issued in March 2021, which calls on member states to agree a set of best practices to boost deployment and investment in very high-speed networks. So as the implementation of the report nears end of April this year, I think it's a perfect timing for us to explore whether or not the toolbox and other instruments that are available at EU level do help us address the question and hopefully close the digital divide. So with me today, as I mentioned, I have a formidable group of experts that are going to join me in moving forward in the conversation. Just to give you an idea of how we have decided to tell the story of the panel is that we will start with Anna Torvakova, who will take us through the point of view of a regulator. Martin Duckworth will sort of set the scene from a broader perspective as to where we stand, what the challenges are, and how to move forward. And then we will dive into the industry perspective. And I think the panel is particularly rich in the fact that we have different industry voices and different segments of the industry to also take us through their reflections and the challenges they face in trying to reach this objective. So we will be looking at the views of the telecoms industry, of the manufacturing industry, but also of the satellite players. So without further ado, we can dive in. I think people are here more to listen to the experts rather than me. So I am very happy that we have Anna Torvakova, who is the council chair of the Czech Telecom Office, the CTU. She is a lawyer in training, has had many years of experience and practice and private practice as well in the Czech Republic. So Anna, I think you want to take us through your perspective from a Czech regulator looking at the connectivity toolbox in itself. Is it enough? Is more needed? But also looking at other instruments that are available at EU level, including the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, etc., and looking at, from your perspective as a regulator, what are the tools you have in your hands and what are the challenges you are facing. So over to you, Anna.
Hello, thank you very much for your words, and I'm very happy to have an opportunity to be here. I'm quite a little bit sorry because I'm not in Europe and our Wi-Fi connection is not quite stable. So hopefully we will have a good connection, and that will be very good for our discussion just right now. I think that the toolbox is not a magic instrument. It doesn't work without all other factors, and I don't see that the issues can be solved only through the toolbox. The last time when we maybe awaited this magic instrument, that was in 2014, when the directive was negotiated violet, but it did not come true, perhaps, and because we were so many starting lines through the EU and so many strategies, so many interesting, and the directive is so far from bringing miracles and hardly brings quickly results. It is clear that the directive needs the revisions, but revisions that takes in usually regulatory feelings, there is no time to wait. So to step aside, the toolbox were very welcome. Even I think the revision will be much more helpful, if it is often the case that collecting the best practices and corporations brings very good results, often better than prescriptive legal acts. Now we can expect publication of the proposal for the revision of this directive by the Commission, hopefully before summer, but as we know, Commission, sometimes it could be a winter. For the time being, we have here this toolbox, and that is what we have to work with. Not enough, but everything what helps is welcomed. As I see, the toolbox is something like a set of best practices, which we put together all around the EU countries. As such, it is very helpful and important. It is references and inspirations. I don't believe that one size would ever fit for everyone. Different countries, different practices, different difficulties, and we are facing a very colorful reality work. So that's why I think that there is definitely cannot solve all the problems or ensure that the digital divide will successfully be bridged. We live in a market economy, and that what I don't think so we have put into the digital divide. And as I said, the state should prepare on environmental and legal frameworks which will help to improve the network, and it may also help financially if we will be able to prepare for helping. Well, target subsidies are a very good tool and can help too, but it is, or it should be, the business who develops networks, who invests, and who will be the one who will meet with the demand of the end users for connectivity and digital service. Through the pandemic, COVID-19, we have been truly shown by the status of the networks in Europe. We can see that the networks are robust enough, very large special monitoring mechanism to the possible problems, congestive network overloaded, but only very rare that happens. But we have also seen that the coverage and take-up is not perfect. But as often, we have to see that the countries are very different. If we will be covering Czech Republic, we will face a big problem with a lot of small villages. Greece has a problem with islands. 200 islands to cover is as well a very difficult thing. I don't think that the indicators which are presented to public give us a true quick picture of availability. EU-wide indicators are every time simplified, and they don't capture the real state of network and service in each member state. Now, for example, the DESI, the indicator which says the very high capacity network or AGA network are contracted as a technology-based metric. And we are very disappointed to say that, for example, for us, it means that 1/3 of AGA connection are excluded. Why should they, if they are enough with the capacity and the quickness? We support the proposal of EU Parliament to hide the principles of the technology neutrality. And we hope that we will find not only the things how to make the networks quicker to be built, but as well to be built everywhere, because that's quite important. And I think that's one of the roles which the regulators have to play. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was very interesting, and I think it's very insightful to have the perspective from your region and your market. And I think, as you rightly said, it's important to keep in mind that not two European countries are the same, and that needs to be also reflected in the approach, hence the no one size fits all approach. Maybe just, if I may, to take you back to your comments about the Broadband cost reduction directive. I'll get there. Can you share with us a bit your thoughts in terms of the review, and what do you think are the top priorities or elements that, in your view, should be considered in the review of the directive going forward in order to meet the objectives put forward?
We can't tell that it's an enemy, but I think it's very important that we will be able to hear each other. We are not the only regulator, and we are not the only one who is building. It's very often that we build another networks, and even that we don't put inside the internet. And that, of course, is a big enemy. And the directive is not thinking about this. As I've seen the results of the research, a lot of countries are facing the same problem. I am the one network, and don't try to connect with me when I in the hole. And every time when you face the towns, they don't want to do each hole each year for another network. So to put all this together is very important, and I think that was in the beginning why this directive has found the light. But in the end, it's not very often used. It is used just for cost reduction, not for as well the helping to the environmental things and other, because not to do holes each year helps as well to the citizen. Everyone knows that when he goes his street and another open hole means, oh, again, a problem. So that will be, from my position, very important. And hopefully, as a presidency country, we will have some possibilities to discuss this problem.
Thank you. Thank you. I have just a quick other question, and before moving on as well, and again, perhaps also as a presidency country, but as a regulator, what are the main barriers hindering, in your view, the development of or the closing of the digital divide? From your perspective, what are the main barriers you cover? Yeah.
I'm so sorry, it has wrapped somewhere. Can you please repeat the question?
Sure. I hope my there's no problem on my side, because then we it's the blind leading the blind. But no, I was just asking you with regards to being able to address the digital divide and close it as quickly as possible. What are the main hindrance or the main barriers you see in terms of achieving that goal?
Cooperation, which is necessary to will not only the networks together, but as well the heads of the town, municipalities, and so on and so on. It is about a discussion, a big discussion which will lead to a cooperation, and then we can build quickly and reduce costs.
Thank you very much. So we'll keep that thought for the discussion we have at the end of the panel. I think a key word, a big word in capital letters, cooperation. I think some call it the multi-stakeholder approach as well, but I think it's an important term. Thank you very much, Anna. So now we move on to the sort of setting the scene part of the panel. So Martin, we'll hand over to you. So Martin is the associate director at Frontier Economics. He has extensive experience of the comms sector, as your bio says. You started working in that field in 1995, so you've gone through liberalization and many transformations that some of you are old enough to remember as well, but not wanting to admit to it. And you have extensive expertise as well in regulation and financial services. So I'll hand over to you, and I think you want to really address and focus on the EU targets with regards to very high-speed networks, but also looking at the business case in terms of investment for fibre and 5G associated to them. So over to you, Martin.
Okay, thank you, Fiona, and thanks to the IIC for inviting me. I mean, as Anna said, when looking at the EU targets, I think everyone expects most of the investment to come from businesses. And in order to get that investment from businesses, then obviously you need to kind of make a sensible business case. And, there is a kind of a huge challenge in terms of the business case, both for fibre and for 5G. The challenges are somewhat different, but in both cases, they kind of reflect two factors. To get to this sort of 100% coverage of fibre and 5G in urban areas, it's going to require a big step up in the investment required to meet these targets. And that's in the context of quite a lot of uncertainty on the returns to investors for making these investments. We've seen, in previous rounds, 4G investments, a lot of money was spent, and that didn't really generate a return for the investors. Actually, mobile operators saw their ARPUs kind of decline over time. Similarly, on the fixed side, there's been less kind of increase in ARPUs over time to kind of justify new investments. And looking forwards, there remains quite a lot of uncertainty on returns, and in the face of uncertainty, investors will tend to kind of sit on their hands rather than make investments. So thinking about how government and policymakers can kind of address this, well, I think the connectivity toolbox, as Anna mentioned, is welcome. It does sort of show best practice in how to reduce the cost of rolling out networks. Any revision to the BCRD will hopefully sort of improve the kind of practicalities of sharing infrastructure. Toolbox also sets out some helpful tools for increasing mobile coverage, including state aid. But I think everyone kind of recognizes that whilst there's kind of a big pot of money out there, it's not going to be sufficient for getting to 100% coverage, and you still need businesses involved. And there's some elements around kind of spectrum availability, which are also kind of welcome, but are very much kind of best practice. But even with those sort of toolbox initiatives, there's still a big question of whether the overall regulatory package, including the changes that are kind of being brought through the code, are enough to meet the targets. Have they shifted the regulatory dial far enough towards investment to make a difference? And I think there are kind of three big areas of uncertainty. I mean, the first is whether member states and NRAs will actually take the tools that have been given to them and create a more investment-friendly framework, taking advantage of the code, because there is a certain level of discretion in the code, and also implementing the toolbox, which, as Anna said, is best practice, but not everyone meets best practice. I think a second very important aspect, particularly for things like fibre investments, which you put the money in and the expectation of getting returns over quite a long period of time, say 20 years, is, will investors be convinced that this shift will be maintained in the long term? Will they get sort of consistent regulation over the lifetime of the assets to allow them to make a reasonable return? And while the code's made some moves towards that by, say, extending the kind of the market review period for 5 years, that's still quite a short time compared to the kind of length of the lifetime of the assets. And I think the final point, which is kind of very relevant with kind of the DMA and various other initiatives at the Commission level, is looking at the economic value created by the rollout of the new networks. What share of that value can the networks expect to capture? So we've seen with 4G networks, it's created a kind of a huge ecosystem of apps, of smartphones, and yet when you look at the kind of the value captured by the mobile operators, it's actually been a relatively small part of that total. And is it possible to kind of shift the dynamics of the market in order that the kind of infrastructure investors capture sufficient amounts of the value created? So I think those are my kind of three challenges, which is to very much look at it from the investor perspective and do the changes that NRAs and the Commission are implementing meet that investment challenge.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much also for tying everything in terms of, yes, there are tools available, but the tools are all dependent on the legal framework that is already in place, i.e. the code, the regulatory framework. But as you rightly said as well, the progress will also depend on the interpretation that member states and NRAs will place on the code, and the power of discretion that is left, or some of it that is in the code. But perhaps if I can bring you back to the point you also touched upon, and that is with regards to finding support, investment support through potentially using state aid. I'd be interested, particularly given the uncertainty on the business case that you highlighted in your introduction, how do you see the role of public investment versus the role of private investment going forward?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, particularly when you're looking at sort of 100% targets for gigabit networks, I think everyone accepts that there's a certain proportion of the population which is never going to be served by commercial investors, and that requires state aid. Having said that, I mean, state aid is not a panacea. It's actually quite difficult to set up an effective kind of public-private partnership. We've had some sort of experience with the Irish National Broadband Plan, which is kind of now in place and rolling out networks, but it did take 5 years for that kind of plan to come to fruition. So while state aid is welcome, and state aid both in the fixed sector, but increasingly in the mobile sector can kind of fill that gap, it's going to take some while for that to kind of come on stream.
Indeed, and I think we should probably also address that question in the overall discussion that we have as the panel, and maybe just one of the points, I think an important point that you also highlighted, and that is about capturing the share of the value created by the new networks. What do you think is the role for policymakers to address that question, and perhaps to address the imbalance, I guess, is what you were pointing to in your presentation?
I mean, there's no easy answer to that one, I think, and clearly there's lots of debate, and people have very strong views. I think the problem is putting in place a set of remedies which kind of tilts the balance but doesn't completely disrupt the market. And doesn't have huge unintended consequences. We've seen in other jurisdictions which have kind of tried to kind of shift that balance. Certainly in South Korea, there's been some initiative to get compensation from the the GAFAs or the GAMAs, as we should probably call them now. But it's not necessarily kind of a straightforward thing to do. But it's definitely something that policymakers have to engage with, because the kind of the status quo isn't working in terms of investment. And so if you're looking to meet these targets for, say, 5G rollout, but the mobile operators see that they won't capture any of the value for doing that 5G rollout, then it's not going to happen.
I'm sure we'll hear more about capturing the value, and that's a nice segue. And thanks a lot, Martin, for your great introduction. And I think you're going to probably create a lot of thoughts, reactions, and I'm sure we'll see questions related to that. But I think it ties in very nicely to moving on to our next speaker, who will open up the industry segment of this panel. And we have the pleasure of having Juan Montero from Telefónica, who's Telefónica's Chief Public Policy, Competition and Regulatory Officer. So that is quite a responsibility and quite a broad role. So Juan has been in Telefónica since 1996 and has held numerous leadership positions within the legal department of Telefónica. So Juan, and I must also say, and apologies for sharing your private life, but Juan is also kindly joining us, even though COVID has had a reach all the way down to his place in Spain. So he is recovering, but joining us in full force and doing the best you can, considering that the voice may be a little bit fragile. So with that in mind, thank you very much for being with us, Juan, and over to you.
Good morning, Fiona, all panelists and all attendees to this conference. I'll try to do my best today, and I hope my throat will make it possible. But let me start by thanking IIC for this invitation to this very high-level panel. And I would start now by trying to bring to this room two examples of how relevant telecom industry, telecom operators have been in these very, very recent years or days for Europe, and how important it is to fix the digital gap in this situation. And I think it is appropriate at this moment in time to remember that during the pandemic, telecom operators showed their commitment to ensure that telecommunication networks operate in Europe in a reliable, stable, and secure manner. Life continued in the digital world thanks to the telecommunication sector, among other industries, of course. And we had a huge responsibility, but it was a real privilege to us. The effort was great, more than we thought we were going to be able to do it, but we could substantially contribute to overcome the crisis and sustain economic activity and society as a whole in Europe, different in the different countries. But now we are again in a dramatic scenario, and I would like to understand the commitment of the telecommunication companies, all of them, to help and alleviate the situation of Ukrainian refugees in Europe. Connectivity seems to be a very technical word, highly relevant to our industry, but we are discovering now, and we already knew or should know, that in the current terror circumstances in Europe, connectivity shows that it's something as essential as connecting one human being to his loved ones. And it means very essentially a part of our personal, family, and social and professional life. So I'm very pleased to know that since the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, European operators have taken rapid and concrete actions to help the people of Ukraine communicating in and outside their country. So in this scenario, fulfilling a digital gap seems to be much more than just an economic or a infrastructure question. No? And entering fully into today's subject, I would like to start on a positive note, despite the current circumstances and the uncertainties ahead of us. From an European perspective, I think that these circumstances are awakening Europe to the reality of having to reduce its dependencies by developing its own capacities in the digital field. Namely digital sovereignty or strategic autonomy, the reality is that Telefónica, as a European and digital and technological company, cannot agree more with this renewed European aspiration for building its own digital leadership. I think we have the right diagnosis of our digital gaps and also the right plan to overcome this gap. And this is what the European Commission called the Digital Compass 2030. The Digital Compass has underlined the relevance of digital transaction with very ambitious targets for the digital decade and a policy program also called Path to the Digital Decade that is expected to be adopted in Europe in mid-2022. In terms of connectivity, apart from other aspects, these targets include reaching every household with gigabyte capacity and developing 5G in every populated area of the EU by 2030. However, we need to be realistic and remember at this point that we also had ambitious targets in previous European plans, namely the Digital Agenda 2020 and the Gigabyte Society 2025. And reality is that we failed or are now on our way to fail to achieve those plans target. So the necessary question today for us, or at least in this forum and in Europe, I would say, is we'll get it right this time? And what could be the recipe for success in this occasion? We believe the vision of the European leadership in digital connectivity must be complementary with competition policy on the one side and regulatory practice in the telecom sector on the other side. And honestly, we very much believe that these two elements are necessary conditions for success to reach the targets of the digital plan. And in this regard, Telephonic vision is very briefly as follows. Competition policy should be driven towards enabling sustainable and pre-investment market structures at national level. This is a necessary element for telecom players to gain scale. With this move, users and businesses will obtain better and higher quality services, leaving behind a context market by a regulatory-driven over-dimension of the number of players in each market, affecting long-term investment capacity. Let's recall at this point that the investment gap of 150 billion euros to upgrade fixed infrastructure to gigabyte speed has been already identified. And also another 150 billion euros will be needed to enable 5G coverage in every populated corner of the EU. On the other hand, sectoral regulation needs to evolve because the paradigm applied successfully towards liberalization of the sector 25 years ago is no longer fit for purpose today, not in Europe, neither in any other place in the Occidental world. By keeping the regulatory focus on artificially reducing entry barriers and lowering year after year prices for consumers, we have led the telecom sector in Europe towards a downward spiral that is no longer sustainable. From 2011 to 2020, revenues in the telecom sector in Europe have decreased by 29%, while in the US they have increased by 20%. We are today the only deflationary sector in European current economic context, and this is incompatible with connectivity target of the Digital Compass 2030 and the aspiration of a European digital ecosystem. So European policy and regulatory approach need to be aligned with the strategic objective of maintaining European telecom sector also in a long-term future. But apart from this approach that could be maybe a bit negative, I honestly think there are reasons for a prudent optimism because we know the problem and we know the way out of it. So this is why the reason is urgent and we need to review both the European merger control policy and also certain provisions of ex-ante regulation. And at the same time, at this point, I must praise the Commission for reflecting in the connectivity toolbox the need to facilitate the deployment of very high capacity fixed and mobile networks and reducing the cost by, for example, removing unnecessary administrative hurdles and streamlining in-permit granting procedures. Also reflecting the need for pro-investment spectrum policy, as the spectrum policy historically in Europe has been one of the most revenue-extracting policies within our European context. we have made an estimation and concluded that annual license fees paid by telecom operators in the European Union, Norway and Switzerland together exceed 150 billion euros. As we remember, this is in the period 2000 to 2017. So this is exactly what we needed to cover the whole European Union with 5G. So the review of the broadband cost reduction directive is although a further step in the right direction of decreasing the cost of deployment, as a number of problems in terms of effectiveness in the implementation remains. So there are positive steps ahead, but we still need to do the most important steps ahead. And before ending this initial conversation, and that's just one more minute, a point that I consider extremely important, and it has been already raised by the previous, by Martin. And I would like to refer now again to what is being calling the OTT fair share. Telecom operators in Europe are investing in a never-ending cycle to address the 50% annual increase in data traffic in our networks, upgrading our network infrastructure, but expanding and increasing capacity. Meanwhile, European telecom retail markets are in a perpetual decline in terms of profitability. The fact is that the largest digital content platforms are not contributing to the development of these digital infrastructures and do not compensate by any means operators for the traffic they inject. And their strong market position, their asymmetric bargaining power, and the lack of a regulatory playing field has, as far as today, made it impossible for network operators to successfully negotiate any fair compensation. So we think that there's a clear rationale for policy and legislative action here, and we welcome the IIC proposal for an EU declaration on digital rights and principles, which incorporates the notion of all market players fairly contributing to the development of digital infrastructure. This is an important step forward in getting the European Union institutions to legislate in favor of sustainable infrastructure investment. But we look forward to continue the dialogue with the European institutions and with these OTTs, and to work on the analysis and figures to provide a better understanding of the contributions of the different players in this context.
Thank you very much, Juan. I think you've put a lot of ideas out there for us to discuss, and probably for our audience to also react on, I'm sure. But no, I think you've there's a lot of important issues that have been covered and outlined, and I also welcome the fact that you did put an optimistic tone in the presentation by highlighting some of the positive developments that we've seen from a policy and a regulatory perspective. And I think we need it more than ever in today's circumstances. So thanks for mentioning that, and for mentioning Ukraine and the efforts that a lot of telcos, including ourselves, are doing vis-a-vis roaming fees and weighing costs and trying to support people in Ukraine as much as possible. But moving on from that, maybe just a couple of questions for you, if I may, and obviously as a moderator, I'm neutral, but as Verizon, I was interested in your comparison in terms of the difference in revenues, or the decline in revenues, looking at Europe versus the US. Why do you think there is such a difference between both markets? What are your views on that, Juan?
Well, I think the difference, I wouldn't say everything has to do with regulation. Probably we telecom companies have not always taken the best decisions. And I see so not to focus on the regulators, but I think really there is a great difference on competition policy on both sides of the Atlantic. We see what is the market structure in the US and what is the market structure in Europe, in the European Union, and we find great differences. And this is such a capital intensive market that this makes a big difference. I think in the US, you have the two most relevant assets from this point of view. One of them is market structure, and one of them is size of the market. Probably we could have these two objectives in Europe. We really do not have an internal market at all in the telecom sectors. We have a common regulator, but we have 27 markets, and a common regulator at European level, and then 27 regulators. But in each of these individual markets, we have a number of operators that are not a consequence of what is the size of the market, and in terms of free market, are the number corresponding to what is the size and what is the kind of service you are providing there. So at the end, we have a bigger number of operators in each of the and every of the 27 European markets, a number higher than for the whole US market. And at the very end, what is this is just the facts, but what is the consequence? The consequence is such a different return on the capital employed in the US and in Europe. So when we look to investors and analysts, what we find is that we have to consider natural that they say, if I have to decide where to put my clients' money in terms of investors in the stock market, or if I have to decide what operations I'm going to finance, I will look to those where the return on the capital they employed is double than those where it is the middle. So from this moment on, everything take us to a situation where the market cap of both companies and the capabilities to have to gather the right investment is so different. On the other side, the kind of competence that follows a market structure as in the US focus on the satisfaction on demand, providing services at a level that is not only focusing on the price of the service. And competition in Europe has been for 25 years focusing above all in the price of the service. And when you are providing to the same client more and more service every year, it's not economically rational to find that at the same time you are providing lower and lower services to the same client. And this is what has happened in Europe. And it seems it will not change if we don't move those two aspects I try to focus on as market structure and ex-ante regulation in certain particular aspects.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I mean, obviously in the US, we have the Infrastructure Investment Bill, and there's a huge focus as well on not just access affordability, but also with regards to equity and social justice with regards to access to broadband. But we can perhaps develop that a little bit further in our conversation. I have more questions for you, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll keep them for the debate because I think they're of interest to all of us, and some of them are also about your comments in relation to the European digital sovereignty. So let's keep that in our mind. But thank you very much, Juan, for this this hopefully slightly optimistic perspective. I'm trying to find the best qualifications for it, but thank you. So moving on, still on the industry perspective, and now we're moving on to Mark Ivankov, and Mark is the Vice President, Head of Government Affairs in Nokia, and like a lot of you on the panel, Mark also has extensive experience in the telecoms industry and is also active in many industry association boards at EU level and beyond. So I think, Mark, you plan to really focus on the state of play in Europe, the state of play of 5G in Europe versus other world regions, and sort of also addressing the reasons why you think Europe is lagging behind, and what, in your view, could be some measures that could help alleviate that. So with that, I hand over to you. Thank you, Mark. You're still on mute.
Yeah, I'm still on mute, absolutely. Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot. So indeed, I want to focus some introductory remarks on status of broadband in Europe. I also touched a little bit about fixed, and so where are the gaps, and then what can we do about it. I think that, obviously we all know that because of COVID-19, we've experienced that, connectivity is essential to support the proper functioning of our society, and still we have gaps here in Europe. And if you just look at 5G technology, Europe led 5G technology and standards. I think that's quite clear. But we are still lagging behind in terms of deployment versus US, China, South Korea, and Japan. And if you look at the latest figures, today, 50% of EU's population is covered by 5G. In US, we are above 90%, and South Korea is almost at 100%. And then also, if you look at some fixed figures, so for fixed broadband, there we can see that 66% of households still do not have connections higher than 100 megabit. And 13% of households are still not having more than 30 megabit. And obviously, to do good homeworking, you need at least 50 megabit, I would say. So that's what COVID has learned us. So obviously, there are reasons for this gap, and I would like to focus on an important one because and it has been touched already by some other people, but spectrum allocation. And if you look at, a little bit in the past, in 2016, the European Commission published at that time a strategic document, which was called the 5G Action Plan. And it had many useful ideas, and it also included proposals for, the 5G pioneer spectrum bands, and to make those available by the end of 2020. So those bands, I think it's the 700 megahertz, the 3.4, 3.8, and then the 26. Now, if you look at the situation at the end of 2020, where those had to be allocated, actually only Finland made those 100% available by the end of 2020. And at that time, 7 European countries had actually not assigned any 5G spectrum. So and we will come back to that because that's the point related to enforcement that is needed on this kind of decisions. But in the meantime, obviously, fortunately, the situation has come better. And I looked yesterday at the latest figures in the EU Observatory, and there I found that the situation is better, but still we are not there in having every country having allocated the 5G spectrum. We still have 8 countries that have not assigned the 700 megahertz band. We have 6 countries that have not yet assigned the mid band, so 3.4, 3.8, and 20 countries in Europe that have not yet assigned the 26 gigahertz band. So it's clear that these initial delays, even if the situation is getting better right now, have had serious consequences for Europe in terms of innovation and introduction of new services. And that has caused, obviously, delays in companies' digitalization and in the overall competitiveness of Europe. So that's obviously an important point, and I will come back a little bit later what needs to be done there to tackle the issue. But just bringing back another issue is, and it was touched on as well by the other speakers, is related to the return on investment, and where we see that the return on invested capital is twice as much in the US than in Europe. And although the European Electronic Communication Code has helped a bit in this area, still a lot needs to be done. You might have seen the ETNO figures that actually point out to a 300 billion investment gap that we still have, 150 billion in getting 5G fully in use in Europe, and then also another 150 billion euros in investment needed in updating fixed networks. So a lot still needs to be done there. So, what can be done to tackle the issue? And again, coming back on spectrum, we really have to learn from this experience in 5G and having various countries allocating at various times around, various ways of allocating spectrum. Also, the pricing sometimes is very high, so that's also not beneficial for investment in networks afterwards. But the fact that we have these divergent national approaches, if we keep that unaddressed, then obviously we will also suffer in the upcoming 6G technology. And so that's the reason why it's important that we address the point that we are not making the same mistakes for the upcoming 6G, and that we learn from what happened in 5G. Obviously, I think that it's also important that further regulatory incentives are being put forward for investment in these advanced telecom technologies. And we talked already about cutting the cost of spectrum, cutting the red tape for fixed and mobile networks deployment, and I'm sure the connectivity toolbox here can help. And there is also the BCRD, which is important and which we talked about. It was put in 2014. It's under revision now. It's expected soon, but it's an important topic, not only for fixed technologies, but also for mobile technologies. And as we always say, 5G technology is a mobile technology, but you connect the base stations with fiber. So meaning that we need to have the right rules in place as well for fiber, not only for fiber to the home, but also for connecting fiber between the various base stations. And then a last point I'd like to mention, and I'm quite sure that the operators of the panel, Telefonica, but Fiona, perhaps also you in your other role, I mean, in-country operator consolidation. We have not yet touched too much on the point, but I think that makes a lot of sense where obviously it makes sense, and it should be looked at a little bit better. And I know that some further discussions are about that, because the current fragmentation along the national lines is actually holding back the use potential compared to other regions. So these are a number of points that I'd like to put on the table, along with the better enforcement of the rules and the suggestions that are being put, especially related to spectrum. And let's make sure that we are not making the same mistakes with the upcoming 6G as we did on the 5G. So that's it from my side, Fiona.
Thank you. It's quite a lot that you've thrown at us all, so I wouldn't say that is it. But perhaps, I mean, again, I think there's a lot of questions on perhaps digging a little bit deeper in the potential solutions. But before we do that, I think obviously everything you talked about is linked to the challenges and to the targets that have been put forward in the 2030 goals. So what do you think about these goals and about them being achievable? I think Juan made a very good point as to the two previous ones. We failed to achieve them, even though we're not yet in 2025. We already know that we will not reach the 2025 targets. So what are your views on the new targets and their achievability?
Yeah, so obviously, these connectivity goals are important because they help increase attention and drive actions. If you look at the goals, I mean, are they right? So the all households with gigabit connectivity, and then also the 100% 5G in populated areas. I think those make sense and are adequate. But I said, I mean, are they going to be reached? Obviously, 2030 is not tomorrow, but it's still close by, and therefore I think it's important that we would have, annual interim targets so that we can really measure and identify the progress more formally than perhaps what we are doing right now, and so that we can take actions if things are getting delayed. I mean, as we said with the 5G spectrum, at the end of 2020, only only one country was making it, and 7 countries didn't do anything. So it's critical that we put interim targets and that we watch those very carefully. So I think that's something that we might need to push harder there, to make sure that it's not something 2030 and then we just see what happens awaking in 2030, but really follow up formally much better than what we are doing today, and perhaps specific KPIs in the meantime would make sense there as well.
No, thank you, and I think indeed concrete actions is perhaps a way to making sure that they're not just a theoretical target, but more precise than that. And I have more questions that I want to share with the panel, and that will be in relation to why is, and I think this is key to the discussion as well, but why is high speed so critical? But I'd like us to discuss it as a panel because I know we don't have that much time. So I'll pass over, and thank you very much, Mark, for that insightful overview. So Natalia, also someone who is quite brave today, because I think in your part of the world it's 3:30 a.m. So congratulations. I'm not sure I would have got up to moderate the panel at that time because I'm not, at best of times, I'm not always that coherent, but certainly not at 3:30 in the morning. So we have the pleasure of having the last perspective from the industry view, and that is Natalia, Natalia Vicente, who is the Director of Public Affairs and Communications for Global Satellite Operators Association, previously known as ESOA. I keep on saying ESOA, so that I'm saying that to myself, that I have to remember that it is global. And your focus in ESOA is really also looking at the digital divide and looking at what you call the development agenda, and in terms of educating and advocating for what the satellite industry can bring to the digital divide discussion. So I think this is certainly a question of last but not least, because we have looked at different pieces of the puzzle, and I think you are also a piece of the puzzle that forms the bigger picture. So Natalia, take it away.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Fortunately, it's already 5 now, so it's okay. I'm awake already. But it's my pleasure to be here, especially in this kind of panel that I think it brings that precisely that idea of ecosystem together, no? And as you mentioned, as ESOA, we focus very much on the digital divide side, but prior to give that part of the view, and because we're talking about the connectivity toolbox, I think it's very important also to give a little bit of where we are as a satellite industry in terms of 5G and the next networks and the future networks. So what we have seen during the last few years in the satellite environment is that we are a key contributor also to 5G because of the coverage and the expansion that is needed to deploy 5G. So we see mainly the need of this coverage and the reach, and it affects relevant mass market applications. We see it from the backhauling perspective, but also cloud computing or mobility. And in many cases, we see that there is this collaboration that we have heard today, collaboration between terrestrial and satellite sector to be able to provide the services that are our objective, no? And as a last part, what we see very much is that there's not a necessary focus on just the new constellations, but we see all these services happening in all the orbits, what I think is quite relevant. So we've seen during the last few years how 5G has been backhauled by MEO systems or LEO systems that are what is known like non-GSO satellites, but also in many cases we have seen pilots and use cases where GEO has been also backhauling this. We've seen examples of cloud computing with IBM, with Microsoft Azure, and with Amazon that have enabled a one-hop and very high capacity connections to the cloud from anywhere in the world. And another key area, as we were saying, is the mobility, because of the ubiquitous connectivity that it's clearly understood by everyone that is necessary. And these solutions have been tested using 3GPP 5G non-terrestrial networks protocols. So what I mean with all of this is that we have seen that satellite is part of this 5G, whether it is for extending the reach or enhance reliability. But there is a little bit of a disconnect when it comes to policy because of the definitions of latency or speed requirements for example, very high capacity networks that by de facto exclude satellite technology in many cases. And probably this will prevent, and it's preventing innovation, investment, and deployment of viable solutions. So on the one hand, we see this convergence of systems, so a network of networks that we talk about, but on the other hand, we continue designing the future in binary terms and in reference to characteristics that can only apply in certain cases to certain technologies. And precisely on the topic of if this is enough to cover the digital divide or to bridge the digital divide, I think one thing that we have mentioned today is what has happened during the last 2 years, no? And while we see that the connectivity is necessary, we also have seen that it's not just 5G what is necessary. What we need is access to connectivity. What we need is to have any kind of connectivity. My colleagues before have mentioned the percentages of people connected to certain speeds or not. What is also important is to understand the percentage that it's represented by 5 million households that are still unconnected in Europe. So it's not about how much do they have, is the fact that they don't have anything. And I think that's the percentage that we always, it's the most challenging, but at the same time is the one that we tend to leave behind. And that's precisely what all these policies should be focusing also on. During the past few years, we have seen in the satellite sector, and our members have seen a complete increase on the broadband connectivity that it has been demanded, because it was the only solution in rural areas. So and I like to be in agreement with many of my co-panelists today. Certainly the toolbox embraced ambitious targets, but we have not reached those targets before. So what is the point on just putting more targets if we haven't even arrived to the ones that we have already passed? The digital 2030 path is equally ambitious, but again, it focuses on speed requirements. And this risk mainly that we will arrive to 2030 and we will still be talking about millions of people unconnected. So what we need is to utilize all technologies, to embrace all technologies, so we don't create even a 5G divide if we want to talk about. So to achieve our goals, I think it is necessary to put the citizen at the center and think what it is necessary. In many cases, we have seen that less than 10 megabits per second is more than enough to stream and to do work and homework even. So it's not that we need to conform with that, but we need to start from somewhere. We need to have immediate solutions also, not wait for economical challenging solutions to deploy. And we need to incentivize member states to explore those solutions and check what is viable for them. So satellite is advancing. We've seen collaborate, the digital divide will be impossible to breach. And if we continue imposing targets that that hold artificial requirements, we will certainly, I think we will certainly miss our goals, and we will arrive to 2030, and we will be talking about 2040 and 2050 with other different goals. So I think it is important to focus more on the affordability and the coverage than create artificial constructs. I think that whatever it is, 5G or 6G, the future networks, it's not going to be the panacea of the digital future. And what we need is investment in all types of connectivity solutions, including 5G. And that's what's going to be relevant to provide a stable, resilient, and extensive connectivity for all. And I think it's not about only technology neutrality, but necessarily is inclusive technology. Think about us all as part of the ecosystem and providing solutions. And this is the way that I think we can move forward if we want to close the digital divide, if we want to advance in 5G and other technologies and look at the future.
Thank you very much, Natalia. We have limited time left for debate, so I think you made a very clear point, and I think it goes also back to the keyword of cooperation as well. But I think it is nothing is mutually exclusive, and I think we need to keep industry, policymakers, etc., keep an open mind in terms of how to achieve the goals. And as you said, I think. And unfortunately, it's a bit pessimistic, but we don't want the 2030 targets to end up being the same as the 2020 or the 2025 targets. I think that's an important point. So I think it's a combination of all the technologies that needs to be taken into consideration. But I'd like to come back maybe and also bring Anna in. I don't know if Anna wants to react, because you've been silent for quite some time as the first speaker. So I don't know, did you want to react to any of the comments that were made in the introductions from our previous speakers?
Yes, that's fine. I like the word ecosystem. The networks are ecosystem. It's a special, very good founded proverb for such a system, and we have to connect the technologies together. That was what I already said. The DESI index should be neutral, should be based on all possibility technologies. I cannot imagine how we are going to build an optic cable to a lonely island, for example, or a lonely small village with 5 houses on the top of the hills. There is no sense. No one will be able to pay this business case. And that's why I like this connection with the ecosystem of the different kind and different styles of the technologies. It's not important how we are connected. It is important that we are connected and we can work, we can talk, we can do all, look on the films and so on. I'm so sorry, it's quite difficult for me because I hear every second word again. So it's sometimes about this connectivity. So that's what we have to improve as well in Europe. So hopefully we will find the platform for a discussion. And I'm surprised that it's not enough open from the European Commission. But when I see how the policy of DG Connect is, I'm not very surprised. They are focused on big operators, 1 or 2 technologies, and that wouldn't work. If we wouldn't change our mind, if we wouldn't find a platform for the discussion, if we wouldn't stop doing revisions of these things like the SAEs, we would never feel that we are going straight to the goal, because we will be every time looking on the form, not on the what we need.
Thank you. I think these are very, very important comments and principles that you underline. But I would say that the quality does matter, because otherwise you would have been able to hear all the words that we were saying. And I'm sorry you've only had half of the words and the sentences in the panel. But maybe to all of you in the panel, there was a question that I wanted to ask you, and I think it's quite key to also tie perhaps the discussion to the demand and the needs, and that is really, why is high speed and high quality connectivity so critical? And without wanting to push that question into a certain direction, we also haven't addressed perhaps all the challenges that policymakers and industry is facing in terms of investment decisions, when you are met with a lot of different objectives to balance in the process of investing in these high-speed networks, but also considering the sustainable agenda, also considering the security agenda, the supply chain agenda, the sovereignty agenda, and all that is part of decisions that need to be made and be made part of the business case as well going forward. So I don't know if anyone wanted to react on the panel?
Yeah,
raise your hand. Yes, Mark, go for it.
I can start if you wish. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the topic of sustainability, and I think that's a critical one, because obviously we know that technology has a huge role to play in fighting climate change, but also to reduce waste and everything that relates to a better world. And obviously companies can do a lot, but I think we all know that connectivity can have a positive impact in bringing down the emissions of other industries. And particularly if we see that just 70% of the global economy is still under digitalized, it means that there are still many sustainability gains to be done. And there is, I think, one important policy measure here to look at, and obviously it's not related to connectivity, but the EU taxonomy. I don't know in how much people are aware of that, but so it's a classification system that for environmentally sustainable economic activities with the purpose to channel investments to support these activities. And right now, this taxonomy is ignoring connectivity as a key enabler for improving carbon efficiency, because the enabling effects cannot yet be precisely quantified. And so I think that here we should just be careful that this is not taking too long to include connectivity technologies in the EU taxonomy, because there is obviously a big missed opportunity here. And obviously with how we see climate evolving, saving time is critical here. So that's the remark I wanted to make related to connectivity.
Thank you. Anyone wants to react as well on why these high-speed networks are so critical and why that high-speed connectivity? Yes, Juan, please take the floor.
Thank you, Fiona. I think you really touched on a critical point. We have in front of us travel to be done, and this is the trip to the Digital Compass 2030. I think we all agree this morning, and we all agree in Europe, this is critical and this has to be met this time. But to make this trip, we have to take into account not only investment in infrastructure. You mentioned the critical agenda on green transition, the critical agenda we discover now on strategic sovereignty, only on security. So all this has to happen together. And I think we, telecom industry, and very precisely, I can speak in behalf of Telefonica, we are so committed to the Digital Compass 2030. We need this to happen for Europe, for European citizens, and also for us as an industry. We need to be this big and play our role as European players, or we will not be there. So this is for us a critical question also. And let me understand this point, underline at this point the word you mentioned before, because Anna put it in our conversation, and this was collaboration. To be able to get the final point of this trip and to do it covering all these agendas we have to do, collaboration is the only way to do it. But collaboration is not hyper-sectoral collaboration, and I really think this has to happen, but also collaboration among policymakers and this hyper-sector. So we have to all sit around the same table, looking at the target we have to meet and find a way to do it. And Martin referred before to something that is critical and maybe too economical, but this trip needs a business case to be fulfilled. If this is not a business case, we will not be able to do it. This is not only politics, this is politics and the resources to be gathered to make it possible. So I think collaboration, at the same time, having all these agendas considered together and a clear target for all is the only way forward.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes left. Martin, you haven't had a chance to speak for a long while, so maybe, and we have a really good question that's been put forward to us by Mike Nelson. Perhaps we can answer by email because I don't think we'll have time to address such a big question. But Martin, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a short-term kind of vision, which is we need to get everyone better connectivity, before 2030. But I think when you start looking at the kind of environmental impact, new technologies, digitalization, I think the EU targets are correct. You do need gigabit networks probably and fiber-based networks preferably in most places. There may be some places where it's just unrealistic. And we do need sort of 5G technologies to be rolled out. So I think there's roles for other technologies in that transition and potentially at the margins, but we do need to kind of face into the fact that these kind of new technologies will lead to other benefits that we've talked about, particularly in terms of environmental.
Thank you very much. And I know we're racing through, Natalia. You haven't had a chance to say a few words to end, and unfortunately there'll be the closing words, even though we had a lot of other issues to cover today. But do you want to have a few concluding words in less than a minute?
Sure, I will do my best. But certainly, I think it's important to discuss about high connectivity and because it pushes us forward, and we will have very high throughput satellites, and we have new constellations. Even the European Commission has launched the regulation for a new EU constellation. But we should make sure that we go all with a unified voice, that both DigiDef in our case and DigiConnect, they all embrace the technologies and the capabilities of satellite, the current capabilities of satellite and the future capabilities of satellite. I know we have talked a little bit about the spectrum, and I think it is important that we maintain and consider all the technologies that are being used currently and in the future and protect them. And certainly there's one thing that I think it's very relevant, that is the need to be consistent with all the different initiatives. So not to push just for objectives and targets in a European level, when, for example, in the United Nations, we talk more about the meaningful connectivity and achieving that meaningful connectivity by 2030. So having really a focus on not just having to choose between 5G or nothing, but more a focus on how can we connect everyone, how can we have that holistic approach and an inclusive approach. And that would be my concluding in, I hope.
Thank you so much. No, you did it right on time. And again, I'm sorry we didn't have more time. I'd like to thank the panelists who were brilliant. And I'm sorry we only had an hour and 15 minutes. We would have needed more. The keywords that came out today was cooperation/collaboration, but also ecosystem. We could have touched upon the supply side, demand side, the governance questions between EU level, member state, NRAs, and we talk about spectrum, but that will be for perhaps another session, hopefully. But no, I wanted to thank you all. It was fascinating and frustrated we haven't gone beyond that, but it was a very interesting panel. So thanks to all of you. And this is what I hand back to Lynn to introduce the next panel. So thank you very much, everybody.